Now we're going to look in our examination of slavery in the 1700s. We're going to look at some of these slave rebellions, alias slave revolts, or slave uprisings, which most historians now don't think is as accurate a term, because again, uprising denotes that you are rising up against proper authority, and slave masters, I don't think, can be considered from our vantage point as proper authorities. Anyway, we're going to look at a list of these revolts and talk in detail about some of them. And we're not going to confine ourselves just to the 13 English colonies, but we're going to start there because we're going in chronological order with the biggest ones of the first half of the 1700s. First big one in New York City in 1712. Remember, I said that there was this huge slave auction at Wall Street, and that by the mid-1700s, 20% of the city of New York was African American. Well, there was a big revolt there that led to 9 white people being killed. The rebellion was squashed, it was put down, and as a result, 18 slaves were executed. Next, 1730 in Louisiana Territory, the French colony, the Natchez Rebellion. 1733, the island of St. John in the Danish West Indies. We haven't even talked about Denmark having colonies, but they had these, now known as the Virgin Islands. So on the island of St. John, there was a slave revolt. They also had sugar plantations there. The Danish did. A slave revolt that led to the slaves controlling the island for 6 months until it was retaken. In Jamaica, there were over a dozen slave revolts in the 18th century. We're going to look more closely at them. 1736, Antigua, which was an English colony in the Caribbean. Guadeloupe, which was a French colony in the Caribbean. 1737, there will be another one in Guadeloupe that we'll look at in detail later. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. That was the biggest one in the 13 colonies in the 18th century. And then another one in New York City in 1741 that led this time to 34 people being executed, and that included slaves, some free blacks, and 4 white people who had helped the slaves in their rebellion. All right, well, let's zoom in for a closer look at what happened on the island of Jamaica. Now, Jamaica was initially colonized by the Spanish, and it was taken away from the Spanish by the English, I think, in 1655. So it was a Spanish colony for a while, then it was an English colony. We're going to be talking about people that have come to be known as Maroons. Now, that doesn't mean that they were the color maroon. It doesn't mean that they were shipwrecked, which is another meaning of the word maroon. But in this case, and this is not confined just to Jamaica, Maroons were runaway slaves who successfully ran away, who actually escaped and gathered together to form communities of runaway slaves and then their offspring. Maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which is how such folks were referred to by the Spanish. Now, cimarron means wild or untamed, but the original etymology of the word, it could come from an old Spanish term for thicket or dense woods. It also, etymologists believe, could come from the root word sema, in Spanish, which means top, and often refers to like the peak of a mountain. So Cimarron, wild, unconquered people. That could also mean either or, the people of the thick woods or the people of the top of the mountains. And in Jamaica, the interior, is very mountainous, especially on the east end of the island. A mountain range there called the Blue Mountains. Now, here's what happened on Jamaica, and similar things happened on other islands, and not just in islands on the mainland as well. So, when the Spanish were defeated, let's take a look at the Spanish occupation. They were in control of Jamaica for 150 years, and in that time, just like in Hispaniola, just like in Cuba and other places, the first thing that they did was to enslave the indigenous Native American people of the island. And those people, the people who lived in Jamaica, were Taino, just like in the island of Hispaniola. They were the same language group. They were related. And just like in Hispaniola, most of them died. Most of them died of disease or were worked to death by the Spanish. Some of them managed to escape way up into the mountains, way up into the Blue Mountains on the west end of the island. And because it's very, very rocky, very steep, they were able to remain there because the Spanish army couldn't get to them. So what happened after the Taino workforce had mostly been exhausted, just like in the other islands, they started bringing in African slaves. Well, when the Spanish were defeated by the English, and the English started to take over, and the Spanish withdrew and abandoned the island, a lot of their slaves escaped. They escaped, and they went up into the mountains and joined with the few remaining Taino people who were living there, and they all lived together in a mixed community, and they started to intermarry, and over time they sort of blended into one group of people, and they were called Maroons. And like I said, the same thing happened on other islands that were held by the Spanish, that term Cimarron, for the runaway slaves who escaped, usually up into the high places where they couldn't be retrieved from. So you got these Maroons, these black communities, mixed black and Native American communities, way up in the mountains. And then, of course, England took over the island, and they brought more slaves because they're still growing all that sugar to make that rum. And that brings us to some of the rebellions that took place in the 1700s, beginning with a rebellion in the 1730s that was led by a group of slaves. Actually, it was a family. It was several siblings. 4 brothers and a sister who had all been captured in West Africa together and wound up being sold into slavery in Jamaica. The sister, who was called Nanny, she was actually the leader, then the co-leader of the family and of the group that followed them was the brother named Cujo, and then there were 3 other brothers. And they started a revolt, and they gathered many other slaves to them, and they escaped up into the mountains and joined in with the Maroons up there, some of whom were escaped slaves, many of whom were the descendants of escaped slaves. And they went to war with Great Britain, a war that lasted for a decade. By the way, Nanny was also referred to as Queen Nanny or Granny Nanny. And she was apparently an extremely competent leader. Finally, there was a treaty signed with the British in 1739 that essentially was a draw. The British Army did not successfully, completely defeat the Maroons. They did not recapture them and bring them back down into slavery. They basically let them stay up there. And the terms were, the deal was, the British said, okay, well, we'll stop trying to catch you if you promise that you won't allow any other runaway slaves to join you. And they said, sure, but then they kept doing it anyway. And then about 20 years later, there was another brief war called Tacky's War. Then there was another big war with the Maroons in the 1790s. Now, because the Maroons were never decisively defeated or conquered, and they kept their freedom, because of that, when eventually things changed and there was no more slavery, and then Jamaica became the country it is today, Nanny and Cujo in particular are considered to be national heroes of the Jamaicans. And in fact, there is a here you can see a statue of Nanny, and then a memorial to Nanny and Cujo. January 6th is a Jamaican national holiday called Cujo Day. And I wanted to talk in detail about this because, well, for one thing, it's a much happier ending than most of the stories about slave rebellions or slavery that we'll talk about, because in this case, the slaves essentially won, the ex-slaves now. Essentially, they won. And they were greatly helped to do that by the terrain on the island. Now, several of the other islands had maroon communities, and just about every island that did had some high mountains in which those maroons could hide. But just a few minutes ago, we were talking about runaway slaves in the 13 colonies, and I talked about swamp communities, especially Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina. Those folks were called Maroons as well. Maroon is the English sort of attempt to pronounce the Spanish word, cimarron. That's where they get maroon. In fact, I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit to the late 1700s while we're on this topic because it all ties in. The Seminoles. I'd said earlier when we were talking about the new groups of Native Americans that were formed in the American South after the Spanish came, I said that the Seminoles as a nation didn't exist until the late 1700s, that they were actually Creek Indians. They were Creek Indians who had moved into Florida, basically taking over the land that had been formerly inhabited by tribes that were either wiped out by disease or wiped out by the Westos and the Yamasees, who were raiding them for slaves. And then those Creeks moved in. The Creek Indians were extremely receptive to runaway slaves. So African American slaves in Georgia, South Carolina, if they could get down to Creek territory, especially to northern Florida, then they would be welcomed in. They would not be turned back over. They would, in fact, often be adopted into the tribes and intermarry, and sometimes even reach positions of leadership in those tribes. And the people of Georgia, the English-speaking people of Georgia, kind of compared this situation with those Creek Indians and the runaway slaves they entered, kind of compared them with what happened in Jamaica with the Taino Indians and the runaway slaves there. Or, eventually the people the Spanish called cimarron, which was corrupted in English into maroon. But in Georgia, in trying to say cimarron, it came out Seminole. And that's where the word Seminole comes from. It means wild and unconquered, and applies to those formerly Creek Indians who admitted so many African Americans, many of them runaway slaves, into their ranks. So all kind of ties together. All right, well, I said I would go into more detail about the Stono Rebellion, but before I do, I have to talk about yet another war between the European powers, because this is something that kind of sets the stage for that slave revolt. This war, not one of the major wars in the history of the New World, you may not have studied about it in middle school, is called the War of Jenkins Ear. And the whole thing started in 1731 in the Caribbean, when a British merchant ship commanded by Captain Robert Jenkins was seized and boarded by a Spanish Navy ship, despite the fact that the Spanish and the British at that point were not at war. They were taking a little time out, I suppose. So Jenkins' ship was boarded, and the captain of the Spanish ship very angrily told him that the English had no right to be in their shipping lanes, and said, well, actually what he did was he took a knife and reached out and cut off Captain Jenkins' ear and then handed it to him and said, "Take this back to your king and say that if we find more British ships in our territorial waters, that this will happen to him next." So Captain Jenkins took his ear and went home. 8 years later, this finally resulted in a war. Now, there's a story that the war was sort of encouraged. It was sort of like drummed up when in 1738 Jenkins was asked to appear before Parliament to tell what had happened to him and his ear. And he had pickled his ear. And so he takes his ear out and shows it to Parliament. They wave it around. Why, how dare those Spanish be going around cutting off good English ears like this? Now, there's actually not any record in the parliamentary records of that happening, although that is the story. So maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But the fact is that by 1739, England was worked up enough to go to war over this 8-year-old incident. Why did it take so long? Because England wasn't ready to go to war in 1731, but they were in a better position to a few years later. So the war began 1739, lasted about a decade, although most of the fighting was in the first 2 or 3 years. And most of the fighting was naval between English and Spanish ships in the Caribbean. However, there were some land battles, particularly in North America, because remember, Florida was controlled by Spain, whereas Georgia was an English colony. The Spanish, who were located in Florida, marched northward and invaded Georgia in 1742. Now, going back a little bit, remember James Oglethorpe, the guy who had founded the Georgia colony, a former member of Parliament, and before that, an Army officer. This is the point at which he re-entered the English Army as a general and led the fighting against the Spanish in his own colony of Georgia. And then once the Spanish were repelled, that's when Oglethorpe went back to England, because by this point, the war had grown into a larger global war. It became part of what was known as the War of Austrian Succession that involved a bunch of European countries. So that's why Oglethorpe wound up leaving Georgia and then the people of Georgia were able to institute slavery while he was gone. But in a way, that's beside the point, but in a way also it is kind of relevant because all this ties into that slave rebellion, the Stono Rebellion, which gets its name from the Stono River just outside Charleston, South Carolina, which is where the rebellion started. Now, the rebellion itself was led by a slave named Cato, also known as Jemmy. Now, Cato was from the Congo, and he had been captured in Africa and gone through the whole transatlantic ordeal and wound up being a slave in South Carolina, which when his new owners bought him, they didn't know a whole lot about his background. The fact is, he was from the Congo, where he had been a military officer, a highly trained military officer. He was literate. He could read and write English and probably other languages as well. So this is the kind of person that can organize a good rebellion, which in fact he did. And the whole thing with the War of Jenkins Ear, how this ties in, is that, so this is going on, these slaves are in South Carolina. Georgia is in between South Carolina and Florida. Remember, if the slaves could get to Florida, they would be free, not because the Spanish don't believe in slavery. The Spanish just don't believe in the English or helping the English in any way. So if English-owned slaves run away to Florida, so much the better. But that was kind of a tall order if you're in South Carolina, because there's a whole other English colony you have to go through, Georgia. Except, all of a sudden, now the Spanish army is in Georgia. So you don't have to make it all the way to Florida. You just have to make it to where the Spanish army is, and you'll be free. So, much like the other rebellions that we talked about, this one started with a small group of organized slaves attacking their masters on the plantation where they were, and then meeting up with other slaves from other plantations and attacking those plantation owners, and then going from plantation to plantation, freeing the slaves and thereby increasing the size of their force as they marched southward toward the Spanish forces from Florida. As they marched, they chanted over and over again in English, "Liberty." Well, they didn't quite make it. The South Carolina militia reached them before they reached the Spanish. And there was a big battle, and the rebels were defeated. When all was said and done, about 24 white people had been killed, counting the ones that were killed in the initial beginning of the rebellion and then the ones who were killed in the battle. About 200 slaves were killed altogether, because obviously the militia was heavily armed, much better armed than the slaves were. A few of the slaves managed to escape from that battle and continue trying to make their way southward. The English hired Catawba Indians and Chickasaw Indians as trackers to hunt down and recapture those slaves who had escaped the loss that the rebels had faced. In fact, the Chickasaws became well known as professional slave trackers, hunting down runaway slaves for the English. So they got several, a handful, I don't remember the exact number, something like half a dozen, actually managed to make it to Florida and freedom. All right, well, this was a pretty big deal. A lot of white people got killed. That'll get white people's attention. And in fact, it did. This happened in 1739. In 1740, in South Carolina, a new law was passed in the colony of South Carolina, the Negro Act of 1740, that had several different parts to it. Number one, manumission, which means freeing your slaves, which is something you could do because it's your property. You can do what you want to with it. So if you want to set them free, you could set them free before this. But as of 1740 in South Carolina, if you wanted to free your slaves, you had to get written approval from the colonial legislature. And how likely do you think it was that you would get that approval? Almost impossible. This virtually means that there would be no more freed slaves, no more free blacks coming about because of manumission. Also, a 10-year moratorium on importing new slaves from Africa. So no more new slaves from Africa for 10 years. Why? Well, they didn't want another Cato. They wanted some kind of a screening process to be set up. They made it illegal for slaves to grow food, earn money, assemble. That is to say, just gather together even and talk, or to learn to read. So this is similar to Bacon's rebellion, and this is the sort of the pattern that's going to be followed. There is a slave rebellion, and immediately afterward, the rights of slaves and free blacks are further restricted, and laws get even harsher. Now, the final part of this law, the Negro Act, said that owners who abused their slaves could be punished. Well, that sounds like a step in the right direction, right? The whole point of that is that if some people are being particularly cruel to their slaves, that makes it more likely that those slaves will rebel and run away, or start killing people. So let's discourage that kind of behavior. However, this one is more of a discouragement on paper and not in fact, because since slaves were not allowed to testify in court, how could any slave prove that their owners were being particularly cruel to them? So that's kind of like a loophole there, a way to make it seem as though they were doing something positive, when really they were not. So, like I said, this is a pattern that will be followed in the rest of the 18th century and into the 19th century, where slave revolts are concerned. Now, around this time, that is to say the middle of the 18th century, there was an abolitionist movement growing in England. There was not really much of an abolitionist movement to speak of at all yet in the English colonies. Now, there were some individuals, like some Quakers, and even a handful of Puritans, even earlier than that, who had been opposed to slavery for religious reasons, but they were always a very small minority. However, a movement was starting to grow in England opposed to further English involvement in the slave trade. And here I have some individuals who were very important in that British abolitionist movement of the 1700s. So bear in mind, these people are not American. They're not really involved in anything that happens in the United States other than kind of sort of by association. First of all, on the left, Olaudah Equiano. Olaudah Equiano was a slave. He was born in Africa, taken captive, sold into slavery, where he was owned initially, I think, by a Dutch owner, and then eventually made his way through several owners, and then was able to get his freedom. After he got his freedom, yes, Gustavus Vasa was the name given to him by his Dutch owner. After he got his freedom, Olaudah Equiano wrote a memoir. He wrote his autobiography, which detailed what it was like to be a free person born in freedom and liberty and have that taken away from you and be forced into slavery, and what slavery on a day-to-day level was like. And this book sold a lot of copies in England and made a lot of Equiano something of a celebrity, even, and aroused in the English population sort of a sense of outrage about the whole slavery situation. There weren't very many slaves in England. There were some, but there weren't very many, so most people didn't actually see this stuff being practiced. But now they're able to read about it from a first-hand account. And that really helped the abolitionist movement to grow. So remember that. Another person to remember was a member of Parliament named William Wilberforce, who met Olaudah Equiano and who was deeply moved by Equiano's story. And he basically devoted his career, starting in the 1770s, I think, 1770s, 1780s, devoted his political career to trying to end slavery in Great Britain. And eventually his efforts, or the efforts that he spearheaded, came to fruition in 1807. The Slave Trade Act was passed by Parliament. Now, this was not an American law. This is a British law. Slave Trade Act ended all English involvement in the African slave trade. So, no more buying and selling of slaves. Then finally, in 1833, long after Equiano and Wilberforce had passed away, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed by Parliament so that Britain ended slavery in 1833. And that included in all its colonies. But those 13 colonies in North America were no longer colonies. They had been a different country, the United States, for 50-some years by this point. So it didn't apply to them. But after 1833, none of the English colonies in the Caribbean or anywhere else had slavery. Now, this final person that I have pictured here on the right, he was a British abolitionist named John Newton. He was a clergyman. He was a pastor. In fact, he was a spiritual advisor to William Wilberforce. And he's best known. You may have never heard of John Newton, but you may have heard of something he wrote, a song called Amazing Grace. Well, John Newton, as it turns out, had led an interesting life. As a younger man, he had not been a clergyman at all. He had been the captain of a slave ship. And as captain of a slave ship, participating completely and fully in the slave trade. He did all the nasty, terrible things that we've talked about here. He threw people still alive into the ocean to drown or be eaten by sharks if it looked like they were sick and might infect the other property. But then he had a religious conversion and became a clergyman, completely turned around and repented of his earlier life, something that he was deeply, deeply ashamed of having participated in. So the next time you hear that song, think about the person who wrote it and think about what those words really mean. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. So he, in his opinion, had been a wretched individual, but he repented of that and turned around. And all of England followed. But, like I said, guess what? Those former colonies of England did not.